Well, welcome and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Tonight is a special evening of storytelling. You may be hearing these stories for the first time, or you may have heard these stories many times. But the point is this: these aren't just stories about Perimeter Church. These are stories about what God has done in and through Perimeter Church. And there's no better place to begin than to start with the man who was here at the beginning, Randy Pope.
Yeah, that's probably, thank you. Yeah, you know, as you look back now where we're telling these stories, it's been nearly 47 years, I think. So a long time ago, but some great, great stories. I never tire of telling the stories because they do for me what they do for others. It just encourages you about the greatness of our God.
So you and Carol have been here since the beginning in 1977, and here we are tonight in 2023, still telling these incredible stories. But before we dive into the stories, let me introduce myself. My name is Laura Story Elvington, and I serve here on staff with the worship team as well as with the leadership team. And my first encounter with you was in 2002. I heard you as the keynote speaker at a college conference that I attended. You spoke on discipleship. And little did I know that so many years later, I would get to serve on staff with you. But before I can tell the story of Perimeter Church, I need to begin with a conversation that you had, I think it was towards the end of your time in seminary. A conversation that was significant and a certain statement that was said to you that changed both your life and ours.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was in my last of 3 years at seminary, and I was leaving a classroom, and two of our students in my class just said, "Hey, Randy, would you come sit with us for a few minutes? We'd like to talk to you." And I said, "Absolutely." I knew them, but we weren't close friends at that time, not extremely close, but certainly we knew each other. And so I sit down and they look at me and they said, "You know, we've just been talking to each other a little bit about a ministry that you're having on a college campus nearby, and I hear wonderful things about that ministry, but at the same time, we've just been thinking there's something missing in your life that we think is very critical, and we don't find it. We don't see it." Well, I had no idea what in the world. They don't know me that well. What are they talking about? So I said, "Well, what is it that you're talking about?" And they said, "We don't see a commitment to the world." Well, that's all they needed to say, because these were children of missionaries. They were missionary kids. They had grown up overseas. They'd come here for college to the United States and then had decided to go back with their families and continue in ministry. And they were recruiting people like me to go back with them. And I saw right through it immediately. And so I said to them, I said, "Yeah, you're probably right, but help me out. Tell me what you're talking about." And they said, "Well, here's the question, Randy. Where should the greatest attention be given? To the greater need or to the lesser need?" And I said, "Well, to the greater need, obviously." And then they said, "All right, question number 2, Randy, where do you think the greatest need is today? In terms of the gospel, is it within our confines of our nation here, or is it beyond our seas and to other countries?" And I said, "Well, obviously." And in the mid-70s, I'll assure you, the greater need was certainly beyond our borders. And so I said, "Well, it'll be overseas." And then one of them said this to me: "So how do you know that God doesn't want you over there?" And I had no answer. And before I left there, I said, "I'll make a commitment. I will," and Carol with me, because now this was my last year of seminary, and she and I had been married, the year right before I took a clinical year. And so she was in this search with me to figure out, what am I going to do, at this point, after I get out of here. It was not a thought that, I'm going to definitely be a pastor. I didn't know for sure. So anyway, all that led to a commitment that I made to these two. And I said, I will search out equally opportunities globally as I would stateside. And that was good enough for them, and I kept that as a commitment. Carol as well. And so we looked at a lot of different places, and this, that, and the other, and nothing seemed to fit the passions, the gifts, the things that we just didn't see anything until one man, Dr. John Edmund Haggai. Now, You could be confused. During these same years, there was a man, Dr. Hagee, that was a different person altogether, sometimes confused, but it's Dr. John Edmund Hagee. And I had known him because it was under his ministry coming to my city where I grew up that I walked the aisle to say I'd like to give my life to Christ when he was preaching. And not even to know till years later that Carol did the same, almost a year from that time. She, at her home church in Birmingham, Alabama, she did the same thing and made a profession of faith at that time in her life. And so he became a family friend of ours, and I got to know them. So he contacted and said, hey, what about the idea of you working with me as my kind of a right-hand associate, and we'll take the national ministry here globally. Well, there all of a sudden I thought, now this sounds like something I could really get into, particularly because what an amazing man he was, what an amazing leader. Oh my goodness, you just sit in his presence, you go, this is a man that God has really, really used and is using. And so that seemed to be something that we might say, oh, that'd be good. But Carol and I prayed, and we had no sense that it was the right thing to do. So I went to, actually was headquartered here in Atlanta. And so I drove over to Atlanta to talk to him and explain that it just doesn't seem like it's the right thing for us, but we don't know what I'm to do. I have no idea. And I'll never forget that deep voice that he had. And he looked across the table and he said, Randy, you're thinking wrong. Well, I thought he's saying, because you should be coming with me and you're not thinking correctly about that. But that's not what he was saying. He said, it doesn't matter what you do. And even went so far to say it doesn't matter whether you're in the business world or whether you're in what they call a Christian occupation, whether you're stateside, you're overseas, whether you're a pastor, whether you're a parachurch, none of those things really matter. They just don't matter. And I said, well, then what matters? Because that's what I'd been focused on. I said, well, what matters? Never forget, he looked across and said, the only thing that matters is that whatever you end up doing, you be sure you're attempting something so great for God, it's doomed to failure unless God be in it. When I heard that, man, it was a ricocheting in my brain. That thought just kept going over and over, and I took it home with me, and I began to think, I don't like failure. And I don't want to just say, okay, this is doomed to failure, I'll jump into it, and I don't want to do that. So that unless God be in it, how do you know if God's in it? And that's when my theology says God can do anything, but I'm not expecting God to speak audibly to me in such a way that you would hear the same thing I heard and everybody would hear it in the room. And, oh, must be God. That doesn't happen. So it could, but it's never happened to me. I'm not going to expect it to happen. And so with that, this was my assumption. We all as Christians, don't we believe that God speaks to us? Oh, yeah, we say yes. Well, how? Oh, well. And I said, I think that God speaks through the conscience. And when you invite God to speak to you and you prolong that effort long enough that you really are begging Him and urging Him to be present and to speak to you, that not that whatever comes to my mind is going to be from God, but I thought if I keep a pad on my lap and a pencil or pen in my hand and say, Lord, I'm here to record what I think you might be saying. Prompt my mind, think, and I wrote down all kinds of things, not so foolish to say, well, whatever I wrote down, that's from God. No, not at all. But I said, Lord, I'm going to invite you then, I'm going to invite you to take, if there's something on those pages that is from you, I want you to burn it into my heart so deeply that I have a conviction that I have sinned if I don't follow. And that's how I'll know it's the will of God. And that's when the idea of planting a church came to mind. And so once that I had zeroed in on that, and I had spent dozens and dozens and dozens of hours, I will assure you, before that finally came to fruition. But the next question to me was, well, what makes it doomed to failure if I plant a church? And, and I can honestly say, being at that time 24, I guess, 24 years of age, that maybe 23 at that time, but whatever, 23 or 24, I had no experience. I'd never preached. I didn't have any of the credentials you would think of. And so in that way, it truly was doomed to failure, lest God be in it. But But I thought, Lord, what else would make it doomed to failure? And so I started spending dozens and dozens and dozens of hours asking the same thing, but now not what do I do, but Lord, what does that church look like? What does it look like 20 years down the road? And I began to develop a picture of it, not of a building, but I mean a picture of what the church would be like. And I had a ring, I can't tell you how thick it was, just describing every aspect of the church that I would see, let's say 20 years down the road. And what's so wonderful about it is, I think if you looked at that 20 years later and saw Perimeter Church, you'd say, wow, maybe God did speak to me. And that's my conviction. I said, let's go. And therefore it seemed like, well, let's go. We got to do it because this is what I know we're supposed to do. So that was Dr. Haggai, how he impacted me with that. Attempt something so great for God, doomed to failure, lest God be in it.
And that statement has been so baked into the DNA of our church. A few months ago, you and Carol invited over some of our new pastors, as well as our current head pastor, Jeff Norris, and you shared some more stories about the beginnings of Perimeter Church, and even about some of the obstacles that maybe other people don't know. I'd love to share this moment. Let's watch.
You mentioned that Perimeter was doomed to failure because you were going to be the pastor. Could you kind of explain that a little more?
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to let Carol, you share a little bit about being doomed to failure. What made it so doomed to failure?
I think we look at a lot of things. Number one, he was 25, I was 24. We just graduated seminary. He'd preached a few times, maybe a senior sermon, but not regularly. Had ministry on college campus and with college kids, but we had no money. We had a 2-month-old baby. We didn't have a core group. And most of our friends that went to start churches had a core group, people that were, there waiting to welcome you and help you. And he didn't want a core group. And I was like, I kind of want somebody to bring me a meal or help me out a little bit. But it turned out to be a blessing. So many of our friends had started churches with core groups, and it didn't necessarily go well. It was maybe a group of people that had strong ideas about what they wanted in a church. And because he had these pages of what he wanted, it would have potentially been a conflict. But I think it felt doomed to failure. We were excited. We'd seen God answer prayers before. I was so busy trying to learn how to be a new mother. I just left the logistics up to him. He felt called to Atlanta, like, yeah, let's go. God had put that on my heart too, but we did feel a little bit like it could have easily failed. And we felt that a lot.
Yeah, and it goes though a lot deeper than that. I mean, I did. You got to keep in mind, as she said, I was not prepared for this in any regards. But I found a high school assessment test that had 40 different careers on it, and it had the numbers that you ask question, whatever. And mine came out. There were, of all the 40, my lowest one was a single-digit number. It was anywhere from 1 to 50, and the top ones were right on target. And the last one said minister. That was my lowest one. I got 8 out of the whole. I mean, it was like so I wasn't wired, to be the pastor to begin with. So those kind of things, the very beginning type of things. But there was another factor, and that's what I sensed on that paper that I kept as I was listening to the Lord, because the idea was to bring Greater Atlanta, a church that would be used of God to bring Greater Atlanta into an encounter with the kingdom of God. So it wasn't just a church. It was using a model that to that date, I don't know that it had ever been used before. We called it one church, many congregations. And we ended up building multiple congregations, like now is pretty common. But that had never been done before. And so we were riding on a model that was very, very, very unique. And so put all that Carol said with that, it really did. I thought, how is this going to happen? How do we bring Greater Atlanta into an encounter with the kingdom of God?
And Randy, it took an act of faith to leave everything you knew to follow God in pursuit of that big vision. And that story is just a small picture of the lengths to which you both had to depend on God for everything. And there's another story that I want you to share that's pretty early on. Tell us about your first Sunday in Atlanta.
Yes, we had moved in early to midweek, I don't remember when, to Atlanta. We'd come from seminary. Carol had had a job until we had our baby, and then that job ended, and we didn't have much money when we were in seminary anyway. And when I mean not much money, we had virtually no money, living almost, day to day or week to week, whatever. And so Carol had to quit her job. She has her baby and our baby. And then, from that point on, we were rolling. It was time to come to Atlanta. So we had already secured an apartment here in Atlanta. And so now it was time for us to make the move. And so we packed up our few possessions. We move into the city and in our little apartment. And we find out that we have to pay our first month's rent the end of that first week we just got there. Now this is in June. It's very, very hot, as you know, in Atlanta. And we couldn't even afford to have electricity. So we had no air conditioning, nothing, with a little baby. We actually arrived in Atlanta with $10. And we had come into an agreement with the newly formed, maybe 2 or 3 years prior, PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, and they had hired me to come actually to plant. But I did not realize until we were well here that we did not get the first month's payment till we'd been here a month. So we had to work a month to get our first paycheck, which was very small anyway. And so here we are, and we find out that we have to pay our first month's rent that Friday before the end of the week. And so here we are saying, oh my goodness, we don't have any money. We can't even do that. Are they going to kick us out? What's going to happen? And so with that, we had a couple of days and we're praying, and I said, Carol, I think the way God is going to do this, we don't know anybody in Atlanta, but we gave our mailing address to a lot of friends that knew we were coming to Atlanta, and you know how you hear the stories of God sending missionaries and people, great Christian leaders, the money comes in the mail, and I felt, well, I'm next in line. Let's see that. I'm sure that's got to be God's plan. And so I say, hey, we've got to just see God do something, but nothing happened. So Friday comes, and now we have to pay the rent. So I walk through and I tell Carol, I said, Carol, I'm going to talk to the manager about our rent. I said, what are you going to tell him? And I said, well, I just have to tell him that we trust in God. God still has our money. I don't know what I'm going to say. I got to think something. I got to tell him something. So I go down and I'm delaying as long as I possibly can. And so I said to the manager, well, I guess you need our money now, huh? And the manager looked at me very apologetically and said, oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot about your payment today coming. I've already taken the money to the bank for the weekend, and I can't keep anything here in the office, and I don't have time to go back to the bank. Could you do me a favor? What's that? Would you mind coming first thing Monday? I said, well, if that helps you, sure, that'd be fine. I come running back to Carol. I said, Carol, God loves to build faith. He wants to stretch faith. And what he does is he waits to the end to cause us just to trust. And you watch, Carol. We got another mail coming Saturday tomorrow, and it's going to be in the mail tomorrow. And so here we are. We have only one big agenda for the day, and that's to meet our mailman. And our mailman didn't stop at all. And I'm telling you, my heart sank. I had zero belief that anything was going to happen now. We're in big trouble. And I remember that night. I remember waking up, couldn't sleep very long. I wake up and my heart's so heavy, and I think we got a baby and we got to buy food, and what do we do? And I remember getting on my knees and just crying and just telling the Lord, I'm at the end here. There's nothing, I don't know what to do now. Where do we go? What do we do? Whatever. Well, the next day, obviously, is Sunday, and we're going to go to church, but we don't have a church. So we decided to go to First Baptist Church, which most of you will be aware, that time was downtown Atlanta, and was probably the largest and most significantly known church. We'd certainly heard much of it, and said, let's go to First Baptist. And so we check our son Matt into the nursery, and we're walking toward the door to go into the sanctuary area, and who is coming out but an old buddy of mine from college days. And this was a man that God, in His providence and grace, had used me in his life spiritually, and he had always been so appreciative that he actually had, while I was in seminary, on a couple occasions had sent money in the mail, there it is, and sent money in the mail unexpectedly to just say, hey, I want to help you out, know you're at seminary, blah, 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 blah. And for whatever reason, I didn't feel comfortable accepting that. So I'd send it back and say, thank you, give it to someone in greater need. We're okay right now, but thank you anyway. And that was the end of that. Well, this is the guy, I'm walking toward the door, and he's coming out the sanctuary door, obviously the previous service, and we're about to go in, and he looks up to me and he says, Randy Pope, what are you doing in Atlanta? I didn't say it, but I'm thinking, to get your money. That's because I'd heard he was doing well in his business, and I knew his interest and desire to help, and that he would love to help. And so we're talking just for a minute there, and he said, man, I know it's time for the next service to get going, and we got to get in. Do you mind if I sit with you on the back row, on the end of one of the pews, and when the sermon starts, I'll slip out. But I want to just catch up and hear what you're doing here and so forth. And so I'm thinking, yes, Lord, thank you for the provision. And I know most of you can understand what I'm saying when I say God spoke to me. Again, not an infallible word, but at that moment, I had this deep sense that God was saying, don't mention money, don't mention need. And I wrestled with God till we sat down. I mean, it's like, God, please don't put my conscience may not even be doing the right thing here, so please don't. But I knew I couldn't violate it. And I never said a word, nothing came up. When the offering came, he's sitting at the end of the pew and I'm next to him, and he pulls out a checkbook during the offertory. And so I assumed that he's writing a check to the church made for God. He'd folded it, he was holding it like he's waiting to put it in the plate. So I take the plate, I give it to him, he hands the plate to the usher, and he takes that check and he reaches across into my shirt pocket and he sticks that in my pocket. And he says, I hope you'll accept this. I said, I will. This one was not coming back, I will assure you. And all I could think is, how much is it? And I knew he was leaving, when the sermon started, so I was anxious for the sermon to get started. And he sat there the whole time, stayed to the end of the service to leave. You hate to say, how much did you give me? By the way, I'm needing, But if you looked at how much money we needed, it was about $600 to get the payment and everything we needed to get through that month. And I'm telling you, when he left, I pulled it out and there was a check for $600. Met every need we had through that month, till we got our first paycheck. And, people say, oh, that's a coincidence. Oh, nobody tells me any different than God intervened in time and space and said, I love faith when you had to trust in me. You doubted me much, but you kept going. And God gave a great gift.
Yeah. And I love that story because it shows how God was providing for you, providing for your family, and providing for our church, even at the very beginning. Well, not only did God use the friends you already knew, but He actually used people who you had not met yet to pave the way for the church that He had in mind.
As we turn off this 285 to hit Buford Highway to go to our first location, this is where our first facility was gifted in many respects. The story is that we had been praying and asking God to show us a location that we could rent, find anyway, and no one had anything. And on the day we called, we said, let's put this prayer day that God will give us the building on that day. Didn't have to, but let's pray. And I just said, oh Lord, you didn't have to answer today, and I know, but we sure do. I sure was hoping you would give us a place by today. And we were only 3 months into the life of our church since I'd come to Atlanta, and we still had virtually little to nothing and no offerings, nothing like that. When that happened, I just prayed, Lord, would you show us? I don't know what to do now. And the name of Cecil Day, and I don't know if you know the name Cecil Day now, but he was the owner, the man who started Days Inns of America. And back in the 70s, it was the leading motel chain in the country for sure. And I'd heard so many amazing stories about this godly man. Was a generous man and so forth. I thought, I need to go see him. Maybe he has some leads or contacts. Carol was sitting in the living room area and she said, where are you going? And I said, well, actually, I'm going to meet with Cecil Day, the president and founder of Days Inns. And she says, wow, how'd you get an appointment with a man like that? I said, I didn't say I had an appointment. I said, I'm going to, to try to meet him. And so I found where his office was. It was a new office building. I go up to the 5th floor, I think where he was. And his assistant was gone. She had stepped out for whatever. But then I'm just sitting there and I said, well, I see his name on the door, and I knew that was, the desk in front was his secretary. I could tell that. And so I thought, I'll just go back and crack the door open, and which for an introvert, that's a hard thing to do. But I just cracked the door open. I looked, and here were two men walking toward me. Well, I don't know which one would be Mr. Day, if either one of them. And I said, Mr. Day? And one of them said, yes, that's me. And I said, I know you don't know me, but I'm here. I said, would you just, do you have any time for me to be able to just see if you have a place we could find to rent or use for a church? He was so gracious. And he said, look, I've got another man coming right now I got to meet with. If you'll wait, I'll put you between the next appointments. And he did. And with a few minutes, he said, I got just the place for you. And I said, really? And he said, I have the place for you. My old office building. Go with my properties man. He'll show it to you. If you think it's the right thing, we'll try to work up a contract for you to rent it. I was so overwhelmed. And I said, thank you. So I go with the property man, and he drove us to the building I'm about to show you right now. And I know when you see it, you're going to go, ooh, that's not a great building. It was the Taj Mahal to us when we saw it, I'll assure you that. All right, this is the location. You see there are two buildings, and this was the building here that we were looking at to see if it would work. And so let's go over here, and I'll show you. There's no elevator or anything, so you can imagine our people coming into this place. They go up the steps, and then this half over here that had just a spine in the middle. They've changed the configuration of it now, but it has a spine that runs right down a very narrow little hallway. And then there were little offices on each side. We walked to the end, and there's about a 20 by 20 gathering room. I don't know if it was a conference room or what, but about 20 by 20. And I look at these little rooms and I say, wow, these are perfect for little Sunday school rooms and nurseries. We get to the 20 by 20, and I thought, boy, we don't even have any people yet. That's a big space. We can have 2 services. I figured out you could put 10 rows or 10 chairs across without a middle aisle, and maybe 5 deep. You could put 50 people in the building. And I thought this would give us a great start. We were looking around and found a little seat in a little place. And he says, well, let's talk about the purchase, the rental of this. And I said, yeah, what's this going to cost? He said, man, I'm giving you a tremendous, or Mr. Day is giving you a tremendous deal. He's going to give it to you for half the price we would rent it to someone else. And we need to add utilities. Let's make it $2,000. And I go, $2,000 hit me like, whoa, big number. But I figured in a year's time, it's possible to raise that kind of money from the gifts that are given. Well, little did I realize, I found out he's talking about monthly. And when he started talking about monthly, I said, man, I was about to say thank you, but no thank you. And before I could say anything, he said, but Mr. Day did say that if you really, really liked it, to give him a call, and he may want to give you that discount And I said, all right. So he picks up the phone, he calls Mr. Day, and when he calls Mr. Day, he looks at me and he says, wow, he is giving you a great discount. I said, how much is it? He looked at me and he said, it's going to be $50 a month. I was, but $50 a month. And that became our first place. This was our first place to worship. And with that, if I took you inside, you would see now it's almost back to what it used to look like in terms of small rooms and offices. But we met there for maybe, I don't know, a few months, and we outgrew our space with 2 services, and we said, well, we can't stay here any longer. Well, Mr. Day got cancer at that point, and when he got cancer, it was a terminal cancer, and it took his life very quickly. He was in his probably early 40s, and but he was so gracious. He'd call me, I just want to know, how is my church doing? He said it in a whisper. And I said, Mr. Day, the church is doing wonderful. Thank you for your generosity. Well, he passed away, and when he did, I asked our first leaders, I said, would we be committed right now that one day if we have our own property, we will build a chapel on the best piece of the property we can find, and that chapel, let's name it after Mr. Day. Now here I stand in that chapel that many years later we were able to dedicate to his name. It's called the Day Chapel, and it's in honor of the man that was so gracious to us that we could even get our start. So we're so thankful for the role he's played in this church. And here's this beautiful chapel now that we get to enjoy. We have worship services in here every Sunday. We have weddings almost weekly and funerals whenever asked. It's a wonderful facility, and it's to the memory of this great man that was so kind to give us our very first facility.
You know, Randy, so many people hear story after story of success, but you would say God didn't just use the successes. There are many times that in the story of Perimeter, God used the failures. And you actually have a really great statement about failure that I think is really healthy.
Yeah, you know, when I would tell this story to our newcomers month in and month out, when I was doing that, I always had to be careful because people say, oh, for you, it always goes great. And of course, we're telling the great stories where God came through in amazing ways. But I always would tag on this little statement, and I can say it's true all the time. And that is, you can do that which you are convinced is the will of God. You can do it with right motives, but you can still fail at what you're attempting to do. However, here's what you've got to keep in mind. When you do fail, you'll always be better off because of the failure. That's the great principle. I mean, God, He's God, and we're His children. You know, it's not what we think. It is a failure to what we were trying to do, but it's not a failure to the bigger picture, and that's the important statement.
Well, can you tell us an example of how God used failure in the story of Perimeter?
Yeah, in fact, since we're kind of talking about facilities here, property, whatever, this is one that certainly was a very, very hard time of what we would consider great failure. We were looking for property, though we didn't have the money to be able to really do what we were attempting to do, but we said it's time, we need to find our own property. So we've been quite a while. There's some steps that came between then, you know, what we've just seen and so forth, but now it was time for us to actually look for property. And so we started looking, and as it turned out, Jim Baird, who has been one of my great mentors now with the Lord, he, at one of our General Assemblies, introduced me to a group of the leaders, business leaders in the PCA, I would say. Jim had already told them that I had found a piece of property that was 50 acres and that we had no means whatsoever to be able to accomplish it, but that we would really love to secure that property, and that's what we're praying for. Well, he, unbeknownst to me, set up at that great week when everybody's assembled this group of business leaders and says, Randy, come to dinner with me. And I came there, and there they were, and they said, tell us about your 50 acres. And they came up with a plan that they would buy a limited partnership and they would make, get tax deduction, da-da-da-da-da, and said, you need to go ahead and do it if you'd like to. We'll purchase it and on your behalf. Well, I was overwhelmed and said, now you're going to have to take care of any down payment. We want you to have some skin in the game, blah, 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 and told me, so I was so thrilled. So we had to submit that to the Securities Exchange Commission, SEC, for them to be able to approve it and so forth, to be able to do this and make it legal. And so I go to the property and said, we'd like to buy your property. And they said, okay, but it'll be, and I forget, it was like $30,000 of a down payment. Well, we didn't have $30,000. And said, you'll have to give us $30,000. You have X amount of time. And so I went to business leaders in our church and the elders of the church and said, what do you think? What do you think? And everybody said, yes, we should do this. Absolutely. So all that, to shorten the story, we turned in our prospectus and it had to be approved. And we had 3 months or something, I think, in the contract we had. Well, 3 months came and they hadn't given it to us. And so I had to go back and say, we need a little bit more time. They tell us it's going to be out very, very soon. Would you give us an extension? And they said, sure, we will, an extra $10,000. And so we got 1 month for $10,000 more. Talked to some business leaders, the elders said, let's do it. We did it. We raised, the other $10,000, but it did not come out in time. The prospectus did not come out. And we therefore could not buy the property. Somebody else was a backup contract. They sold it to them. And it was a piece of property we looked at and said, this is golden. This would be the prime. Oh, this would be so amazing if we got this place. And we were so sure God had worked this out. It was going to happen. No doubt about it. This is going to work out. And we lost $40,000, which was all the money we had raised. That's all we had. And it was all gone. And I will say this about the people of our church, and some of them are here with us even now. And I'll tell you, there was no crying over spilled milk. There was a sense, because of attempt something so great for God, doomed to failure, lest God be in it, that I heard this over and over, said, I'd rather attempt something doomed to failure and fail than never even attempt. Yeah. There can be failure. And I know this, that the people of the church rallied at that to say, man, we got to really give now. We got to make up that money and this, that, and the other. And as it turned out, that piece of property, as golden as it was then, would be one of the worst locations we could have ever chosen, as it turns out. And they built an apartment complex on it, a nice, beautiful complex on that property. And not many years after that, very few years after that, one of the worst tornadoes that's ever hit Atlanta came through, and that was ground zero, and it demolished it. And that would have been our church. So we look back and we say, sometimes it takes time. Sometimes we never see it this side of eternity, but He always works things together for good.
And obviously that wasn't the end of the story. In hindsight, we see how God used that perceived failure really to position the church for an unexpected success that only He could have crafted. Mm-hmm. So tell us about how we landed here in this property on Medlock Bridge.
Well, that's a great story. So now we'd lost that property, and a good bit of time had gone by, and we were in different, locations. Still, we could actually buy more property or have the money or whatever. And so we were growing. We'd been on a temporary, a permanent place that we had built, but we had outgrown it. It was on a 10-acre piece of property. We couldn't hold there anymore. We had to do something. And so we were trying to wedge another building maybe on that property, and the architect says, you're wasting money, you're throwing away money, you need to find a bigger place. So our elders got together, and we all had this commitment. We said, we will never not do something because we believe it's not possible. We will not do that. We will rather ask the question, is it the will of God? If it's the will of God, we attempt it, even if it's totally impossible, but that's the way it has to work. And so these leaders said, let's do this. We need to we don't want to run into this problem again. Let's just take a natural, life. If you lived a normal lifespan and you're the pastor X time, this is as much as we have grown. Let's buy enough property that it would hold us and, through at least your lifetime. And so with that, we did the homework on it, and it was like 75 acres or something like that, and which was really big. And we were going, wow, that's a whole lot of property to buy. And so I went to two of our commercial realtors in the church. And I said, look, would you guys go find a piece of property that meets the description that we're looking for? And we had a list of things. We wanted to have visibility. We wanted to have accessibility. We wanted to be a pretty piece of property. We wanted, buildable and all that stuff. And so they told me immediately, they said, and this is the area that we'd have to have it in. And they said, that's basically impossible. I don't know that exists. But they came back to say it does exist. And it's on the corner of Old Alabama and 141, which was way out from where life was happening at that point. But they said, there's this piece of property and it is perfect. And so I said, well, let's go ask, how much do we have money? I said, this is the amount our elders have said we can put toward it, and this is it, but we're going to have to just go with this. We don't feel it would be appropriate to go any further. Well, this property was multiple times more. They go see the owner, single person owner, and said, we'd like to buy your property, how much? And when they told them the amount, they said, you're not even in the ballpark. And besides that, we already have a contract on the property and it looks pretty good, so I don't think you have a chance. And so they came back to tell me the report on what we're looking at. And I said, well, why don't we just pray about it for a while? And so we got our leadership and all to pray, and let's pray about this. And we were, and so I contacted the two guys and said, would you do me a favor? Would you go back and talk to that same man? They said, why? Have we raised the amount of money? We can be a backup contract. I said, no, same amount of money, but just go ask him again. I thought, why don't we do that? That's not going to be. So they went and immediately were told, no, leave. And they left. And they came back and said, it's a dead end. We just need to understand that. There's a good contract on it anyway. And so I said, well, let's pray about it a few more weeks. And we prayed. And so I went back, and I felt a little timid doing this, but I said, guys, would you do me a personal favor? Would you go back and talk to that man one more time? And they said, why? We're not going to raise the money or raise the number. I said, no, just go. And they said, this is crazy. I said, well, just go, would you? Yeah. They go in to see him, and when they walk in, the man recognizes him, the owner, and he says, you still want that property? And they said, we are. How much? Same amount. He said, sold, just like that. Sold. And they were like shocked and said, you're going to sell it to us at that? Said, yeah, I've come into a downturn of some sort, financial. I've got to get money quickly. Can you pay cash? Well, that was another whole story I won't tell, how we were able to get that money. But it was amazing. By God, it's just an amazing story. But we got that amount of money, and we're set to close on it, if it gets approved. But it's got to have a rezoning done to the property. So I'm out there just walking the property one afternoon, pretty day, and I'm out in a beautiful, just gorgeous piece of property, as you know, because we're on it. And I happened to be walking, and this lady who lived in a home then next door to our property line, our properties line contiguous to each other, and she comes out with a really hard attitude, and she says, what are you doing out here? And I said, well, I'm the pastor of the church that's buying this property. And she said in kind of a snide way, well, congratulations, but you will never use it for a church. Never. And I said, why do you say that? And she said, because my next door neighbor, she's put together, 50 or 60 homeowners, neighborhoods in a homeowners association that covers the whole, and they have power, they can do anything they want. And in fact, that she has stopped multiple groups from being able to get on that property. And said, she will never let you on the property. I will assure you that. So I came back and told one of our staff that was working in this area, I said, look, you need to call this lady and get to know her really well and make sure she likes you a lot and all that stuff. And before he could call her, she called him and said, I'd like to ask you to come to a rezoning, a homeowners association meeting that we're going to have about the rezoning of your property, and we'd like for you to attend. And he said, why do you want me there? She said, I want you to see how enthusiastically I'm going to support your use of this property. and said, I've seen 5 or so contracts. I fought them all because I didn't think it was the right thing. But he said, I became a Christian. I'm 58 right now. And at 50, I became a born again believer. And God gave me a ministry of faith, a gift of faith, and a ministry of prayer. And I've walked over that property countless numbers of time in good weather. And I've prayed over that property. And I've said, God, this is too gorgeous a piece of property. Don't let it be used for anything except something that'll bring glory to you. And when I knew your reputation as a church, and when I heard your name that you were purchasing, I said, this is my ministry to get you on that property. And it was a unanimous decision to let us build on that property. And then I'll tag this on. This is kind of a fun story that nobody knows this story, hardly. She called not too long later after that. She called me and she said, you know, you got a gold mine on that property. And I said, yes, ma'am, I do believe we do. It's just, I can't imagine anything better. She said, no. I said, you have a gold mine on that property. And I said, what do you mean? She said, I want you to come over and I want you to see. I want you to come to my house. I want to show you something. So I go over and she has the plats all over the tables and everything, the maps and so forth. And she has the history from the time that this was a gold mine in the 1800s. And the history that told the story was how many hundreds of workers there were on that property. And they were mining, it's the same vein that comes down out of Dahlonega. And said this thing delivered a lot of gold. And so you have gold mines, you have shafts and mines underneath here, that, and I went, what? She says, I see you don't believe me, let's go. We will go out and she walks and shows me each one. And the size of this stage was about the size of each one of the shafts. And they were sunk about this far, just from the pressure and the time over time. She said, here they are, and it matched the map. And she said, this was a gold mine. And she says, I'm convinced you're going to raise all the money to build this church from the gold you get from this property. And I'm like going, oh my goodness, this is too good. So we happened, oddly, listen to this, we had a man who owned a gold mine company, a major gold mine company, who was one of our elders. And so they go to him and said, would you go look at this and check it out? And his company came in and they drilled all, because we knew we can't even build if this thing has shafts all under it. And said, sure enough, it's everything the map said. And do you know that all of those shafts were up where we were putting parking, where we would put the parking. And so, now I don't want anybody out there in the middle of the night, you know what I mean? But anyway, he said it would never make enough money on this property now at this time with the price of, but it said there's gold on your property. And I said, it's been a blessing to us already without even getting to mine any of it.
That's amazing. What remarkable stories, Randy. And you would be the very first to tell whoever's listening that these stories truly aren't your stories. They're not about Randy Pope. They're not about any one person. It's about God's faithfulness in and through Perimeter Church to do something that only He could do for His glory. And there are more stories to be shared, too many for us even to share tonight. But let me ask you this. I'm curious. If we were to share all of the stories that tell the story of Perimeter, how many stories?
I don't know that number. Of course, the stories would be hundreds because everybody in our church has stories of what God has done and the amazing faithfulness of God. But in these type of things you're talking about, when I was asked, would we do this, I just started cataloging the list of the stories that we could tell. And I came up with, at least 20 right then, I'm sure. But who knows the number of stories. Often I find myself telling a story and say, well, there's another one. I hadn't thought about that one. But God has done some amazing things through the years here.
Alrighty. So, Randy, as you think back on the life of the church and sort of the significant, like, directional changes. What kind of comes to mind as you think about that?
You know, it's interesting. I've always looked at the whole history of our church. Now that I'm looking at it from this end of it, to me, I think of it like the Wright brothers starting to figure out, how do you get in the air? How do you just fly? So we were starting a church. That's all we were trying to do, get the church started. We had a big vision in mind of what we wanted to do, but we had to start with something to just get us off the ground. And but it was a unique off the ground because it was one church, but with a plan for multiple congregations. And so that was kind of the first phase. We started building out we had the first, location where we were, and on Beaufort Highway. And while we were at Beaufort Highway, we launched our first congregation. We called it One Church, Many Congregations. That was our first one in the northwest part of Atlanta. And then from there, we then started a second one, which was our in-town congregation. And then about every 2 years we did this. And then the third one was Stone Mountain area, Parkview we called it.
Yeah.
And you were out there, you went out there to help us get that started. We called it the East, and we called it the West and the East and so forth at that time. And until we had these 4 congregations. And it was very interesting. We were talking about, a plan to bring Greater Atlanta into an encounter with the kingdom of God. We said we've got to have congregations in each part of the city, but not just geographical. We needed different people groups, reaching the people where they are and so forth. And so this was our plan, and we were thinking we'll have 15, who knows how many. But we got to the end of the 4, and it was time 2 years later to start another. The elder said, well, where's our 5th one? Well, I don't know. I know y'all remember how I'd jump in a car. I'd do the first service, and I'd preach
all
it.
over the place.
Preach it at the front end of the sermon. Then I would jump in a car, and I would drive 20 minutes to get to the northwest out there, and then I would preach. I'd literally come in and preach the very minute they had it timed. Then I would jump in the car, come back to what we then called Metro, the first location. And we would, I'd preach that. And it was like crazy. I did that every week, And then we started a second congregation, and now I'm going 1 week over here and the second week over here, back and forth. And then the third, I was doing it. And the elders say, where's our next congregation? And we've been 2 years now. And ironically, we'd had a child every year that we started a congregation. So we had our 4th child. Yeah. And I use that as an analogy. I said, guys, it's kind of like having kids. You're really excited to have 4. But you hear, let's go 5, let's go 6. At what point do I go stop? We just can't do this. So we realized we had a little problem, that we had flown as high and as long as that vehicle would take us. So then we kind of moved to a second phase. And the second phase was what we called PMI. Perimeter Ministries, y'all remember that? Sure, Perimeter Ministries International, and that was just an umbrella organization that would take all of our congregations and let them become independent and so forth. Here is the great story, though, that people don't even know about. We were in this wrestle. What do we do now? We're at 4. I'd taken the staff away and said, guys, we got to figure out an answer, and we couldn't come up with an answer, and we had labored and labored. I'm in my office. I'm sitting back, and I just looked up in the ceiling, and I said, Lord, I don't know what to do. How do we do this? We're stuck. We can't meet our vision. And Athelia, who was my secretary at that time, she came in late afternoon. She said, Randy, there's a call from a man named Carl George. Do you know who he is? And I go, Carl George? Yeah, he's probably the greatest ministry architect in the country, in the world probably, out from California. And I'd met him a couple times, but we didn't know each other. And I said, well, I know who he is. And said, well, he's on the phone, wants to talk to you. So I call him and I say, and I gave him the phone and I said, yes, Carl. And he says, I know we don't really know each other, and this is going to sound really, really strange to you. I hope you don't think I'm weird, but I don't have these things happen. But I just landed at the Atlanta airport, and I think God spoke to me. And all I sensed was God saying, call Randy Pope. And I don't know why. Do you know why I might have called you? I said, well, I think I've got a pretty good answer to that. I just asked the Lord minutes ago, Lord, you got to speak. You got to help me out. I don't know where to go with this thing. And so I told him that, and he said, let's get together. We got together, and he said, I'll work with you guys. And so he went away, and he formed a plan.
Right.
He came back, and y'all remember the officers retreat where we did this, and he presented the thing, and everybody's like, wow. He said, oh, you'll be the main segment. This is where everything will start, and you'll preach the sermons, and you'll have a location here with an assistant pastor, and you can have 50, 60, 70, 80 congregations all over Atlanta. And we'll just have a videotape that'll go out the next week from the week before, and they'll get the sermon a week later, and you'll preach to all the different groups and this, that, and the other. And I remember everybody, I'd love to hear your memories, but I think everybody was like, wow, this would be great. But everything in me said, no, that's not healthy. This is going to be happening one day, but it's never going to happen at Perimeter, because we don't want to build through one person. We don't want to have that. We've got to, and that's what led us to thinking of PMI. But we got to hit the ball here. So I'll tell you the rest of that when we get to the next one. Okay?
All right, cool.
And for those who don't know, those two men, dear friends of yours, Gordon Moore and Brad Nelson, who not only are close friends of yours, but longtime leaders here at Perimeter. There's something you said I want to touch on. You said, we don't want to build through one person. And that's not what you did. You had a community of friends and many others who came alongside you. But at some point in time, you shifted from the model you were describing to a different model. So with so much going on with church planning all over Greater Atlanta, there was still a lot going on right here in your home location. Tell us about the very first Sunday here at Medlock Bridge.
This is another story that very few people know. I don't tell it too often, but when we were building this place, it was just about finished, and we were ready to move into it, and we had a date set. And so I pulled back from that 40 days and said, I want to use this as a fast. I didn't tell anybody that I was fasting, but I said, I'm just going to go on a fast for 40 days. And so I was nearing the end of the 40 days, and God had used that wonderfully, in my life and so forth. But I would take walks at night sometimes in my neighborhood, and there wouldn't be anybody outside. No one could hear anything, and I'd pray out loud as I would take my walks. And this particular night, I was just kind of begging the Lord, pleading, saying, Lord, let your spirit just, let the power of your spirit just rush in and like waves hit this church when we get started. Let it just hit and I'm praying that, and I have this sense, no audible voice. I don't have the kind of experience, or even many experiences like I'm telling you right now. And I had a very, very strong sense that God spoke saying, are you ready? I just heard this sense of, and I hear people say, what'd you hear? I don't know, but it was just, are you ready? And it was so vivid to me that I out loud said, yes, Lord, I'm ready. And then I went, ooh, am I really ready? What if, and I started thinking scenarios and said, would you be ready if God did that and this, and now, oh my goodness, what am I, and I wrestled with it that night. But I started thinking after I said, I'm ready, and wrestled with that a bit, I said, but would our staff be ready? What if, who knows what could happen? And I started thinking some scenarios. So I went to church the next day, and I literally called a meeting for the next morning. And I'd never done anything like this. I said, it's required of all staff. I don't lay dictates out that you got to do, but I said, everybody has to be here. And we're meeting at like 8:30 in the morning. And I just had to talk to the staff and say, are we going to be ready? If God says, I want to do something that you weren't expecting. And so we got all there, and people are curious what's going on. And I started, telling them the story. And I said, I was praying, and it was like, Lord, let your spirit rush in, just like waves hitting us as a church, And about that time, one of our staff, who is known to play a few jokes and so forth, he walks in maybe at 15 minutes late, 30 minutes late. And he comes in and he says, hey, well, what, y'all already started? And I thought he's just joking and all. I said, you're late, but sit down. He said, no. I said, let me ask you a question while I've already interrupted. He said, my wife, when she asked where I was going this morning at this time, I said, well, I'm going. Randy's called a church-wide staff meeting. And he said, what about? I said, I don't know. But he said, it's something very important. And she said, well, I just had this crazy dream last night. Would you just ask him whether it has anything to do with waves hitting the main walls of our church building? Well, when he said that, I just assumed he was standing in the back, he heard it, and now he's going to make a joke, ha ha. And I said, this is not a funny time. This is a time we're really serious. He said, I am too. She wants to know. I said, yes. And I told him the story. And I said, guys, I think God might be trying to tell us something. We got to be ready. Well, it was important because some things happened that we had to be ready. There were some things that we could have never anticipated. It was a wonderful thing that God would have done that, assuming that be the case. But here's the interesting thing. When I got up, my fast was to end the night before the day that we were opening the church. And so I had eaten that night to break the fast, and you have to be very careful if it's been that long a fast. You can only eat certain things and this, that, and the other, and sometimes even then it's pretty hard to get the system going. And I didn't even think about it because every morning I had to get up and kind of get my balance a little bit and being weak, a little bit. But this morning I thought, well, I've already eaten, and I jumped up, 5 o'clock, the alarm went off, and I jump up, and next thing I know, I see Carol over me, wiping up blood and saying, Randy, you've been hurt, you fell, you hit the corner of the table, and I had a big rip in my ear and across my eyebrow through here, and blood was everywhere. And this was Sunday morning, we're opening our church to the public. And I go, oh no. So call a surgeon in our church, he meets us at the hospital, and I said, can you have this where nobody can see it, they'll ever know? And so anyway, we went through the Sunday morning and all went fine. We had a kind of that night to celebrate the opening for the church to come in, and somebody a guy came up to me, one of our men came up to me and said, Randy, actually it was a lady, she came up and she said, something happened last night. I woke up like a heavy burden for you, Randy, that something was not, like you were in danger or something, I don't know. And it was and nothing like this ever happens with me. She said, I got up and said, I'm not going to wake up my husband. I'm going to go into the main room and pray for Randy. And said, when I got in there was my husband. And I said, what are you doing up in the middle of the night? He said, well, I was awakened with this sense of need to pray for Randy, and I've never had something like that happen to me. And I know the man, and he was not an extremely spiritual, love the Lord, but not somebody I think that would be typical of. And she said, me too. What could it be? And so she came up after the service and she said, anything going on last night with you? I said, yes. And I told her the story. A second person came up. Same thing. I was awake in the night to pray for you. Was everything okay? Whatever. And then the third person came up to me, and one of our elders, and he said, are you okay? I don't know why. I woke up in the night to pray for you. In fact, it was early morning. And I told him what happened, that I'd fallen and what had taken place, as I'd told the others. And he said, it was at 5 o'clock in the morning, wasn't it? And I said, it was at 5 because that's when the alarm went off. He said, at 5 o'clock, my eyes came open and I said, I got to pray for Randy. I don't know why. And I think that the evil one was just trying to keep, what was happening was glorifying God. And he didn't want to see this thing happen, and God certainly was the ruler. And we got to open it and everything went great.
It's amazing. Randy, as we said before, we could tell story after story. I want to ask you to share one more story.
Okay.
Perimeter Church has truly been used by God to birth so many other ministries, like Camp All American, local outreach, global outreach. adoption and foster care ministries, but there is one story I'd love for you to share about our student ministries. And I wanted you to share about the Rush Conference. Now, if people are not aware of what Rush is, this is a student-led, student-attended conference that we called Gold Rush. And I would like for you to share about the conference and how it started, or maybe almost didn't start.
And you're insinuating correctly, almost didn't start because of me.
Because of you.
Yes, yes. We had a wonderful director of our youth ministry. Matt was a creative guy that just had this idea that he wanted to start a thing called Gold Rush. And so I would trust Matt Brinkley with anything. I mean, he was, solid as they come and so forth. And he said, here's what I want to do. I want to start a ministry called Gold Rush that will be student-led and so forth and so on. I said, student-led, explain that. So, well, the main speakers will be students. This will be everybody, everything's going to be student. And I said, well, that's like, the uninformed leading the uninformed, that doesn't sound too smart to me. He said, no, it'll be a great thing. It will be a wonderful thing. Well, I had this thing where I certainly believe in to this day, said, let people fail if you have to fail, but try things. It could be. It's doomed to failure. And I thought, well, this is doomed to failure. I just, So I said, well, let's try it 1 year and just see how it goes. So we had I have a friend that's a pastor in Florida, and he would always, anything we did, he wanted to get in on it. And he'd call, how about it? And they learned from us, and they were a younger church, and they loved our church, and very mature man. And he said, I'm bringing my people, bringing my youth, and I'll be the youth director for the week, and I'm going to bring our youth. And love to spend time around Perimeter. So he was here for that week. When it was over, he left, and he sent me a letter, and he said, I've always trusted everything y'all have done, everything's been good, but I have to say, without being critical, that was a mistake. That was not good. The students weren't they didn't this, and it was just the worst thing I've seen come out of Perimeter. Well, that verified everything I knew to be true, that it shouldn't have happened. So I, with great confidence, went to him and said, Matt, it was a failure based on this person that I highly respect and was there for the whole thing. Is that true? He said, absolutely, it was a big failure. And I said, well, it shows us that we don't need to try that again. He said, oh no, we're going to do it again next year. I said, what do you mean you're going to do it again next year? And he said, well, we learn from our mistakes, and it'll be better next year. And I said, I don't think so. He said, no, just give it another year. I knew it was going to be a failure, and somehow, I don't know if it was my insecurity or my fact of, I don't know, but I said, okay, do it, knowing that it shouldn't be done. And I truly believe it's the closest thing we've had to the marks of a true revival that week. And it happened among our youth. God did something so special that I just said, Lord, thank you that you didn't let me get in the way any further than I did. And that thing's been going on how many years now? I don't even know, but decades it's been going on and blessed thousands of young people.
Randy, I'm sure it takes a lot of humility for you to say that. And I don't say that to make much of you, but it just shows that what God has been doing in and through Perimeter is bigger than one person, bigger than one person's opinion, bigger than a letter that you felt like was steering you the right way. I just love the posture of us learning through our mistakes.
Yep. Yeah, Laura, I think it shows that, yeah, you're right. God didn't do it because it's me, and I didn't do. God does things through us, but sometimes he does things in spite of us. And that's one of the illustrations right there.
And it's like we've been saying this whole evening. This is not Randy Pope's story. It's not even Perimeter Church's story. This is and always has been God's story of his hand at work in every step of the way. As we wrap up, Randy, will you share with us what is one last thing you would like for the people here to hear, as well as the people who will hopefully be watching this years to come?
Well, I'm glad I get that opportunity because as we were talking about doing this, I just made a comment to someone who was praying that God would use it for years to come, and I certainly hope that's the case. But my comment was, I want these people right here to be blessed because of what we're doing. I don't want this just to be the telling us stories. Because every time at what we used to call a Taste of Perimeter, some old timers remember that, we would tell these stories and so forth. And I always ended making sure that people knew why we were telling the story. Because it can say like, wow, looky here, look what we've done. Oh, look what, and even, oh, look what God did. And that's what we want, but there's more even to that. And that is because of what God has done in the past, wouldn't it be wonderful if it impacted the lives of us here? Just like we hope that it would impact the lives. That's why I told the stories. I wanted them. And so I would end every session the same way I'm going to end this tonight. I used to say, I want to give you a homework assignment, and I hope you would take this assignment, all of you that are here. And the assignment is a simple one. I mean, it's one that anybody can do. It's just going to take you seconds to a minute, so it's not going to be a time issue or anything like that. I would like for you to pray 2 prayers. And they're very, very simple. They're very similar, but they're 2 prayers. And the first is this: God, would you do something so significant in my life that it would be doomed to failure unless you be in it? And do you ask God, here's my life, do something in it. And when I share that, I know there are people even in this room right here today who would say, God can't do anything significant in my life. I mean, I've got battles I'm fighting. I've got issues that I'm living through, bitterness, resentment. I got all these things. God can't do anything significant in my life. But I love to remind you, if that's what you're thinking, you're the primary candidate for that to happen. Why is that? Because who's going to get the glory when it happens? You're not. You said, I can't. And you said, God, if you would, please do. And so just that to say, what is it that God needs to do in your life that you would just ask the Lord and say, would you please, though doomed to failure, would you please do this in my life? And then the second one is just changing one word to the prayer, and that's instead of in, to say through. Lord, what I want to do is I want to ask you now to do something so significant through my life that it's doomed to failure. Let God be in it. And that doesn't mean it has to be big. It just has to be bigger than you, what you couldn't do on your own. It doesn't mean it's big. Compared to somebody else, it may be very small. But do something through me. And again, I know there are some of you in this audience, as I have been in every time I've ever shared this, I know there are people that are saying, God could never do anything significant through me. I'm an introvert. I can't do this. I've never been good at speaking. I can't do this. And you think of all the things you can't do. Well, guess who? Guess who God's going to pick to do that with? You, because it is doomed to failure, and you know it. And when it happens, it'll be happening because God did it. He'll get the glory. And that's what faith is. Faith doesn't mean I know it's going to happen. It's faith saying, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm moving along anyway in obedience, and I'm going to ask you, do that in and through my life. So that would be my prayer for you that are here with us today. That'd be my greatest joy, is to think that I'll hear some of you in time to come up and say, God did something in my life, and He did something through my life, even when you were doing that little thing at the church that night, and that it would have fruit that would be born from that.
Randy, would you mind praying that for us right now?
I'd be happy to. Let's pray together. Father in heaven, we're going to ask you now that you would do just what we said. First of all, we're going to ask you to do something so significant through our lives, and we pray that individually. Lord, do something so significant in my life that it truly would be doomed to failure unless you be in it. Show me what that is. If it means a pat on my lap or whatever, Lord, just show what that is. For those of us that know what it is that you would have us to do, grant this to be the night that faith is embraced and obedience is followed. And I pray, Father, likewise, that you would do something so significant through the lives of each of us here. And we ask you, do it in my life. And Lord, let me know that the day I meet you face to face, that I would have given my life to something that could have never been done except you did it through me. And that'll be the great joy to applaud you for that. So blessed to that end, thank you for this night and for all that have come and made this such a good evening. We thank you and we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So as we close, let me say thank you for being faithful to tell the stories. And on behalf of all of us, thank you for being faithful.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And thank you for being here and being the family that we've been able to live with and starting new relationships with you that are new to the church. And I hope this is going to be a wonderful place for God to do great things in and through your life. So thank you for being here.
Yeah. We tell these stories to testify of the faithfulness of this generation that followed God into the unknown. But we tell them for my generation and for the generations to come, that it might spur us on to greater faith, that we might do things, attempt things so great for God, doomed to failure unless He be in it for His glory.
Amen. The only thing that matters is that whatever you end up doing, you be sure you're attempting something so great for God, it's doomed to failure unless God be in it.
We have come with empty hands, hearts surrendered to your plans, daring to dream what's doomed to fail, lest you be leading us. In you we trust, and every step you've seen us through, every promise holding true, for every valley mercies new, faithful you have been every step of the way. And we, your church, will grow and thrive, for our cornerstones alive. The gates of hell cannot prevail, as glory pierces darkness. Every step you've seen us through, every promise holding true, for every valley mercies new, faithful you have been every step of the way. Every step of the We will follow you. We will follow you. What else would we do? You alone give us life, Lord, so we will follow you. We'll follow, and every step you will see us through, every promise holding true, for every valley there's mercies new, faithful you have been every step of the way.
Randy used to say all the time, for years and years and years, he would say that we want to, as a church, we want to attempt something so great for God that it's doomed to fail unless God be in it. In other words, we don't want to just try to pull church off. We don't want to just kind of, hey, let's do religious stuff together and call it a God work. No, we want a God work in us and through us so that he gets all the glory. So that we can say time and time again, that would not have happened in you, in me, in us, through us, apart from God. And the way that happens is in a posture of radical dependence.